Alright, so something that didn't sit right with me with the Marvel vs. Capcom series, particularly 2, because that's the one I've probably played the most, was the lack of representation from 3D Capcom fighters on the roster, particularly rival schools and Power Stone, not realizing, eventually after diving, a bit deeper into the genre that statement was completely false and that the laser sword guy Hayato actually came from another 3D Capcom fighter, being Star Gladiator slash Plasma Sword. So naturally, I did pick up the PS1 game and eventually Capcom Fighting Collection 2 when that released. Love 3D fighters. Capcom is well known for, some really good fighting games. Even if this series isn't, one of the more well-known ones, I figured it was still worth a shot. Especially since I didn't really think the barrier of entry was really as egregious as something like Rival Schools on PS1, before we had Capcom Fighting Collection 2. So, finally got around to playing them. The whole laser sword and even, Star Gladiator title isn't the only thing that felt like it was, clearly inspired by Star Wars. I mean, this game or series is pretty unapologetic about it. And to tell you the truth, I'm here for it. I like it. You don't see a lot of major companies even, take the risk and try to be this close to something like Star Wars. There was a few other, familiar things that I felt like these games had. Another pretty egregious one was the character Vector, who is pretty much Jack from Tekken. And to a lesser degree, I mean, you've got Saturn, who gives me some strong Yoshimitsu vibes, and to a lesser extent, I was just calling Zelkin Falco pretty much the whole time. But yeah, the best way I can think of to describe the first game is Space Soul Calibur. And I don't know, I almost wonder, because I grew up and Star Wars was already, really well established, but I know it was pretty revolutionary at the time to have sort of gladiator, I guess, esque, themes and combat and that sort of thing with the whole futuristic setting. And I feel like Soul Calibur and other games like it sort of always had that same approach, and it was just really refreshing and really cool and fun to see, the, futuristic space twist on it. Like, I wonder if this is a little bit of what it was like to experience Star Wars for the first time back when it came out, and that. Just a little bit, And I just really, really enjoyed the game. And going into Plasma Sword, the sequel, expectations were honestly high. I played Rival Schools and Project Justice before, and the jump between the two was huge. So I was once again expecting, smoother visuals, better animations, some fun new characters at the very least, and maybe a new trick or two to sort of set it apart from its arguable sister series there. I believe this came out before Soul Calibur, so the whole thumbstick-tied sidestepping, which I think would have been a nice progression, was probably a little too new at the time and risky. I believe he may have only had like Virtua Fighter 3 and maybe Dead or Alive. It was something I would love to have, seen the series try if it, continued with a later entry. But overall, oh yeah, I just remembered from seeing the footage here too, and adding a story, or more of a story, since it was, from my experience in the PS1 version, very bare bones, the same for every character. I think there may have been secret endings, but if you're like me and more casual and not good enough to get them, that doesn't, really matter. But, here it did, all of the base things I expected, albeit maybe not as strongly as Project Justice did. But a huge, huge, huge issue I had with this game that made it incredibly disappointing was that instead of, trying to be its own thing, I feel like it changed some stuff that were granted more standard for the genre, but it took something that felt unique and made it feel like a worse version of Project Justice with, a bit of a different theme and tone to its, environments and roster and that sort of thing. And I don't know, in my opinion, part of the reason Tekken and Soul Calibur were able to coexist for so long together is because, well, A, they had significantly different theme / tone, which I feel like Rival Schools and Star Gladiator definitely had from both each other and from what Namco was doing. But also, if you're watching, you may not notice, but if you play the game at all, even from, a casual perspective, they play just so much different, especially with ring outs. I really love ring outs, honestly. Like, I have so many good memories of, playing with CPUs or with real people and just having to not just manage your health, but manage your positioning because, you might, occasionally get that crazy match where you're getting your ass kicked. Only a sliver of health left. You've only taken a sliver of health from the opponent, but you somehow, either through, sheer luck or, some skill are able to, pull off a ring out and still win the damn thing. Like, I love it. And that is such a huge exclusion, especially since it was in the first game. Another thing they changed too was the blocks. In the first game, you had a dedicated button, which, I feel like that's not a super common thing. Normally you have, your backwards input to block. I apologize if I said dodge earlier, but I meant block. Smash is the only other game that really does that off the top of my head, and, I think it's, unique. It shakes things up a bit. Not, as significantly as ring outs, but once again, I feel like it's, just sort of little things like that that made the original sort of stand out in its own way from not just Rival Schools, Project Justice, but from, just the rest of the genre in general. And I don't know, it was still fun to, go see the new characters. A lot of clones, but it was pretty obvious, and I kind of knew that going in. And to, see how the story progressed. And it's still a good game. Overall, though, I definitely prefer the first. Probably the most out of all of these games. And I definitely, preferred Project Justice to this, too. And I don't know, it's such a shame. I feel like this game was, took a bad direction and, we never really got another chance, honestly. Although, in my opinion, it wasn't done as dirty as another game in the Capcom Fighting Collection that I'm going to be playing through, another 3D fighter. But that's a topic for the near future.